feel really privileged to be speaking about this rich discussion about people and place. And I'm really grateful to be here. And thank you so much, Kim and Samuel, Family Foundation and Belonging Forum, for inviting me and all of us to be part of this incredible space, and also for all the trust that we have received from the Samuel Family Foundation over the last decade. I was 8 when I first experienced hunger. The war in my native Bosnia and Herzegovina had started a few months earlier. We were persecuted from the place where I, my parents, my grandparents, and their grandparents were born and belonged to. Within months, as Serb armed forces besieged key towns, the local people and displaced people like myself and my family experienced severe and persistent hunger. In just those few months, I had lost my home, a sense of security, and my first love, my dad. Before my dad bled out after being injured and unable to access timely health care, he pleaded with his comrade from the Bosnian army, "Please sell my gun and feed my kids." It always breaks my heart to know that his last worries were not how he will survive, but how his kids will survive. At this young age of 8, I went for the first time to an aid distribution site, where I had to wade through the crowd of desperate people, most of them were adults, and plead with the humanitarian workers who ended up handing me a loaf of bread. I can't forget that bread, not even 33 years later. I was proud I got something to bring back to my sister and my mom. In fact, I ran back breathlessly back to home. But it was also a very embarrassing moment for me as a child that I had to plead for a loaf of bread. Violence, unimaginable hardship, hunger, and lack of access to water were persistent in the years that followed. My mama, she employed unconventional measures to help us survive. We didn't have soap, so she would collect wood fire ashes, which are apparently a natural cleaning agent, which we would use to wash our hair. We collected rainwater to wash our clothes. We often ate expired canned food from the Vietnam War, literally leftovers from another war decades ago, which were distributed as part of humanitarian aid in Bosnia. At the height of desperation, one day, my mother brought home a bag of flour. I watched her in anticipation as she carefully sifted the flour cup by cup. The flour was infested with mouse feces that she carefully tried to pick out. Back then, I didn't care to know. I was just excited that we had bread to eat after months of not having any. I learned the truth about the infestation only a few years ago when she, on a rare occasion, spoke of the war. While I didn't care to know the details then, I knew the impact starvation and lack of access to clean water had on our health. A year and a half in the war, my then 10-year-old sister fell seriously ill from jaundice and spent a month in the hospital. I was terrified at the thought of losing her. One morning, shortly after she had recovered, I woke up terribly sick. I vomited and saw 10 centimeters or 4 inches long worms in my vomit. I contracted the worms because we didn't have clean water, we didn't have hygiene products, and we ate contaminated food. Due to how overwhelmed the healthcare system was at the time, I didn't get any treatment and mostly recovered from the parasitic infection on my own. Already undernourished, I lost even more weight and only fully recovered after we were smuggled out of the country and smuggled into Sweden in November 1994, where finally our healthcare needs were addressed. And now, all those decades later, while I was visiting my mama in Sarajevo in August this year, but the reminders of the war remain ever present. I watched her as she cried and her body shook over the images coming out from Gaza. I was trying to console her. It really breaks my heart when I see my mama in pain. And I was telling her they will survive just as we did. While inside, I was in a similar pain, unsure if Palestinians in Gaza will indeed survive. Horrors upon horrors that Palestinians in Gaza have been going through over the last 2 years, well documented and live streamed to all of us by courageous journalists and others from the ground, have brought back all the trauma of my childhood in Bosnia. 26 civilians in Sarajevo were killed in May 1992 while waiting in line to buy bread, and more than 100 were wounded. While these scenes were playing in my own country, on TV, I watched the news of a conflict in another place and another score of civilian suffering. That was Palestine in 1992. Yet again, in May this year, I relived that moment when I watched hundreds of hungry Palestinians being killed simply for trying to fetch food and aid. The daily photos from Gaza that we all have seen of mothers clutching their emaciated children with tiny ribs protruding, children who instead of diapers wore plastic bags, and headlines such as, I'm quoting, "The latest child to starve to death weighed less than when she was born," caused my heart to break and made me sob. Starvation imposed on Palestinians in Gaza has likely resulted in thousands of deaths and is entirely human-made. It was the product of Israel's government's intentional policy to use starvations of civilians as a weapon of war, a war crime that Human Rights Watch, where I work, documented. In partnership with Kim, actually, I investigated specifically and reported on the higher risks that children and adults with disabilities experience when it comes to starvation. It was literally impossible for most of the people in Gaza to find food. So just imagine how it was for children and adults with disabilities who are on a special diet. One of them is Osman, a 16-year-old boy with cerebral palsy who uses a feeding tube. He lost 7 kilos within just a month. His family told me they couldn't get the specific food he needed, such as vegetables, but also that they didn't have access to electricity to be able to blend his food. Fortunately, Osman regained his weight after his family left Gaza and was evacuated, believe it or not, to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Reports after reports this year by international human rights organizations, by the UN, and prominent Israeli human rights groups points out to the inescapable evidence that Israeli authorities are committing the acts of genocide in Palestine. And here today at the Belonging Forum, I would argue that genocide is the worst case of the denial of the right to belong. It literally has for the aim to bring about a physical destruction of a people in whole or in part. And I know this from my own experience. The armed conflict in Bosnia lasted for almost 4 years and led to genocide. More than 100,000 of my people were killed, and countless left with wounds that won't heal. It took the Bosnian Serb military forces to execute more than 8,000 boys and men within just a few days in Srebrenica for the world powers to finally take actions. And here's what happened. Failures were recognized, apologies were issued, and promises were made to never again let it happen to anyone. And yet, the world let it happen to the Palestinians. For 2 years, they were completely left on their own from the rest of the world in the worst conditions possible. And as Kim mentioned yesterday, there is a greater sense of isolation when you feel the world has left you behind. Yesterday, so many of our panelists spoke about children, including Kluani, that I can't see now, But she spoke about children yet to be born, which really resonated with me. As an expecting mother now, I felt a connection and wondered what kind of the world will my child grow up in? This forum truly gives me the hope he will grow up in a world that I did not grow up in. In a world where just by the virtue of being a Bosnian Muslim, he will not experience ethnic cleansing and genocide the way I did. In a world where the people of Palestine enjoy their right to belong to their land and to exist free of occupation and apartheid, a right they have been denied for 75 years now, more years than most of us here today have been on the earth for. I hope that my child will live in a world where Indigenous people are not evicted or ethnically cleansed from the ancestral land that they have inhabited for generations, and where they have the right to sovereignty and self-determination. I have a hope that my child, in case he has a disability, won't face isolation and segregation the way people with disabilities face today. I hope that my child will grow old and not denied his autonomy because of his age. That he will live in a world where a student with Down syndrome can go to a university. I saw that Fionn had left the room, but Fionn, who is a young man who is here with us today, told me yesterday that he has been invited to speak at 35 universities, but couldn't enroll in one because of lack of inclusion and belonging for people with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities at universities. Someone else said yesterday that no human being is more worth than another human being. And last night, Adriana Clarkson said that belonging means that you feel secure and safe. In my view, we all play a role to ensure that sense of safety and security for all here in Canada, in our communities, and in Palestine. As Kim so powerfully said yesterday at the beginning of the symposium, we only belong if we belong together. And I believe that the world needs this message now more than ever before. Thank you.